Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about The People Under the Stairs from 1991. This is day 3 of my Halloween week of videos, where I review a horror movie every day in the 5 days leading up to Halloween. Horror cinema has a long tradition of making political satire and commentary on various other issues through actual normal horror movies. You might not necessarily know it's there, but a lot of time it is. And Wes Craven's definitely known for that, from Last House on the Left being political about Vietnam to even the Scream films. And Wes Craven's New Nightmare and The Hills Have Eyes and probably a bunch of others I forgot. He's done it quite a few times, and The People Under the Stairs is no exception to that. In fact, that's probably why it's getting talked about so much currently, although it is primarily talking about the Reagans, and the two parents are supposed to represent Ronald and Nancy Reagan. The other underlying thing that this film talks about is gentrification, which, although might not have been as prevalent as it currently is now, was still an issue at the time. And that's probably why this film has probably aged a lot better than maybe it necessarily should have or would have or whatever. I think what you have here is a very tight home invasion film. It's kind of interesting how good Wes Craven is. I understand how he could make something that would be quote-unquote a thriller like Red Eye later in his career, because as much as he was a great horror director, he was great at thrills. Like, he was very, very good at that. He could basically do a jump scare in his sleep, and I guess he sort of did with Freddy and so forth, but he was just so accustomed to it. He knew the rhythm of it, and he knew how to use that rhythm to say things with it. And The People Under the Stairs does it very successfully. So successfully, in fact, you don't really think about that, hey, maybe this movie being called People Under the Stairs is a little weird, since the actual or titular people under the stairs aren't really that big of a part of the film. But you never really think about that. You just get swept up in this kind of a film. Now, I'm not going to say this is at the top tier of Wes Craven's filmography, because a film is relevant to a certain time period doesn't necessarily make it a better movie or better in that filmography or something. Sometimes it does and so forth, and I'm sure this will probably go higher on lists in our current age, and that's fine. I get, that's how film history works and art history works and so forth. A kid named Fool, or Poindexter Williams, who really is just referred to so much as Fool that when I'm reading off Poindexter Williams, I'm like, oh, that was his name, whose family is going to be evicted, and his mother is very sick, and his family friend Leroy, played by Ving Rhames, and another friend Spencer decide that they are going to rob the landlord's house and steal their money, because apparently they have gold coins. I forget how they know that, but they decide to take the young boy Fool and take him there to rob the house. They find out that the house has more than they bargained for, and Fool is trapped in there trying to fight off who are called Mommy and Daddy, played by Everett McGill and Wendy Robbie, who run this evil house where they kidnap children, and when they speak up or try to escape, they cut out a part of them and put them under the stairs, although their daughter or adopted daughter Alice, who's living above in the attic in a perfect white dress, and he is trying to find a way out and hopefully to find the money and take them down as well. I think this film, when you're in the house, and similar to Don't Breathe from last year, has a very intense feeling when you're in the house. You really much feel with the thieves in this. I definitely was sidelining with Fool and seeing where he was going, and it felt tense, actually. A lot of this might have felt a little sillier, and I think this film actually works, and something I've talked about with Verhoeven, but I think works with this film, is when a way you sort of disregard it, and that kind of helps it. Even though I take horror movies and horror cinema seriously, I'd often been told, like, oh, People Under the Stairs, I don't know, Jim, that they liked Wes Craven, but they didn't particularly like this movie, and I was like, alright, well, I guess I'm watching a lesser Wes Craven, but that's fine. I think because of that, that actually helped my enjoyment of the film. I really felt that part was really tense, and it reminded me of those parts in, similar to Don't Breathe, where I felt like tense, where it was on the edge of my seat, where it had that kind of thrills to it, and it held that during the parts it needed to. Wes Craven didn't overload the film with that, so I think when those sections came up, they were actually incredibly intense because of that, and you definitely feel with Fool. I'm not really as familiar with that actor, Brendan Adams, but he's really good. I love the part where he's like your dad's a mother, and your mother's a mother, or something like that. They have a lot of good one-liners. Ving Rhames' part where he's like, yeah, and the president's gonna make me Secretary of Pussy. Ving Rhames is great. He's not in it enough. I really felt with these characters, and I think one thing to have, and one thing that I think Craven does particularly well in his films, whether it's with Sidney Prescott or Neve Campbell, or or Heather Blomkamp in Nightmare on Elm Street. When you feel with the protagonist and you're with them, same with like Laurie Strode and so forth, there's a better and deeper connection there. And I think Craven understands that very well. Even going to a later film like Red Eye, you think of like Rachel McAdams. If you have a strong performance in that film, you will want to follow them and want to see them hopefully, you know, get out of danger and not get killed. Can have reverse effects. There's plenty of slasher movies where I'm like, can you please kill these people? But in this film, I think Brandon Alm, the performance by him is actually very important. Oftentimes we disregard actors, particularly when it comes to horror, but if you get through a whole movie with them, often I feel a deep connection to them because I've been through like this huge experience with them, or at least watched it and so forth. And I think Brandon Adams knows how to play that in a way. This film was often compared to Home Alone because it was 1991, so that's sort of natural. I don't think it is like Home Alone. It's like Home Alone, but sort of talking about the Reagans and, you know, having a little more oomph behind it and actually being scary. I think Home Alone's a better movie. I actually remember seeing this film on the USA Network in the mid-90s, and I didn't watch as much horror then, and it actually scared the living fuck out of me. I remember being really creeped out about it, and particularly about rich white people, but I think it's supposed to represent like how most people view kind of conservative white privilege and so forth, but it definitely freaked me out at the time. I don't think I actually got to see very much cut down, because I don't remember a lot of the violence in this. I remember like the parts that, like, kind of more of the suggested parts in it. And the Reaganomics part of it, I think, is, it's sort of ingenious. I mean, it's interesting because the people under the stairs sound spooky, it sounds scary, but that's kind of the whole satire of it played out right there. It's like the people under the stairs, the things that they want swept under the rug. They want to just progress America in a way, but they're not really thinking about who they're running over to do that, and who they're disregarding, and who they're not helping. The people under the stairs are supposed to represent people like Vietnam veterans and the AIDS virus and what happened to cities at the time, and the poor and disenfranchised, and the welfare queens idea, and how all those people were pushed under the stairs so they can just keep progress and keep making money, and it didn't matter about the poor, it just mattered about the rich, conservative, American apple pie type of family, and how really evil that was. And I think Wes Craven plays that in such a natural way that you can honestly maybe see this probably now, because most of the kids probably who might watch it, I guess. I don't know how many people watching old films don't know history that well. But anyway, you could, presumably you could watch this without knowing the Reagan thing. Actually, in the Siskel and Ebert review, Ebert did not get that, and Gene Siskel didn't necessarily get it, but he brought up another review where someone pointed that out, how it's a Reaganomics horror film, and then Ebert kind of felt stupid that he didn't get that, which is kind of interesting. And I noticed because of that political satire, when the few critics that picked up on it, the other ones would go, oh, okay, fine, you know. Wes Craven was kind of having a better critical reception. Didn't seem like Shocker went over that well, but this one, New Nightmare, was soon after, and even though there was Vampire in Brooklyn, let's ignore that, but then Scream came on, he was definitely having more critical success, and it feels like this was sort of the beginning of that a little, especially at a time when horror wasn't getting the best reviews. Particularly Vincent Canby of the New York Times also kind of was nice to this film, and they kind of noticed it's kind of a little more glaring, the political ideas that's going on. And I think the whole idea of that the Reagans are the evil mommy and daddy who are kind of holding back and holding down the poor and disenfranchised, I think is a really interesting, amazing idea. You could apply this to basically any president, but it's obviously doing Nancy and Ronald Reagan. I watched this for a little bit and wasn't really thinking about that, to be honest. I think it kind of plays in both ways. You can see it either way, but after a certain point I was like, okay, yeah, I know who it is. And I like how it satirizes that and talks about that. Now, certainly this was towards the end of a long stretch of Republican presidents in America, and I think there was a lot of disenfranchised and feeling like we need a break, we need a way to get out of this, and the economy hadn't bounced back, and this was right around the time of what at the time was considered the worst recession since the Depression, which is now funny to say that, but this was around that time. So the whole idea of this kind of film was very timely. This film is actually very interesting because it's like, as much as it is incredibly timely for 1991, it actually plays very well because of the whole idea of gentrification, and they're taking all this money and they're just hoarding it for themselves. This plays a lot into our ideas of wealth and the 1% versus the 99% and things like that. That makes People Under the Stairs a little more potent. I don't think it's as memorable and as shocking and as genre defining as certainly some of his other films. You know, this didn't do what Scream, like, I felt like had a huge wake of 90s films after it. Nightmare on Elm Street began another age of horror. Last House on the Left had a whole bunch of imitators as well. This film isn't necessarily influential. I don't think it's as good. I don't know if you could really make a whole vein of Reaganomics horror movies, really. I don't really think that's Wes Craven's intent every time he's making these, but I think it sort of really works within that. I really like the two performances as mommy and daddy of Everett McGill and Wendy Robbie, who are both obviously in Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks would end about June of 91. This came out on November 1st, 91, which seems like the reverse day you'd want it, but it was #1 at the box office, so it worked out. Wendy Robbie's kind of playing sort of performance you're used to. Everett McGill is not usually as broad and as big as he is here. He's usually a little more subtle. It's interesting to show his range as an actor, and he works so well. I sort of almost forgot about his role in Twin Peaks. I had to like think about it and go, oh right, god damn. That's kind of interesting. This film is often very broad and kind of very clear about what it's doing, but it has such a rich world within it that it kind of needs to be. If you were just kind of like hinting around at things, I think you'd often feel like there's missed opportunities, and oftentimes when they reveal a new room or pathway, you could tell all of the life and all of the incidents that probably happened in that room. And it's a very rich world despite mainly taking place in one house, which could sound incredibly boring. It does feel like often they're going back to the same places, and I will say I think this movie's probably too long a little bit, not like glaringly, but towards the end there was a point where I was like, wait, how much longer is this? Like, for real? It's more of a simpler pulpy premise, but he actually kind of gives it kind of a little more oomph than maybe it necessarily needs. I think he needed to, like, you know, get in and get out, and it probably would have been a little more potent, but giving it that kind of ending stuff and expanding it to a certain regard, I don't know if that works as well as he thinks it does, but I still really enjoy the film. I think it's kind of interesting to have a horror film that we're talking about the ideas, we're talking about other people, and the people who are the titular villains, you don't really end up talking about that much. They're not that big of a part of the movie, but it's kind of bringing up how these people are. They're sweeping things under the rug. They're forgetting about things. They're forgetting about the culture that they're destroying by taking down these neighborhoods and changing them drastically without giving any regard for what the neighborhood's like in itself. As someone who lives in Brooklyn and is shooting this video in Brooklyn, I often find that is one of my biggest problems with what happens to neighborhoods. Is there's one way to be respectful about, you know, the culture and the people who are living there, to kind of inundate yourself with the culture that's already there, to be successful just as a business and really as a person, and just, you know, as a consciousness. You know, you don't just come in and say, fuck all you neighbors, this is my culture, I don't give a shit. And certainly a lot of people have that attitude, and they're horrible human beings and have no real human decency and respect for any culture whatsoever. But I think what this film is showing is kind of, it's one thing to move to a neighborhood and accept that there's another culture there and try to learn that culture, but it's another way to just take it down and destroy it, and just make your culture the dominant one, and especially if that financially profits you, to kind of just destroy an area and change it because it certainly just works for you and your culture and works for you financially. And I think The People Under the Stairs shows that very effectively. It shows the villainy in just sweeping another culture under the rug and not thinking about them, taking care of them, or even understanding that culture, just understanding it is bad because of your more simplistic ways of viewing the world, and not being able to accept the larger world out there, and that, you know, maybe other people have additional thoughts and there's other consciousnesses out there to explore and learn about than just simply your own. I think this film shares a lot of things with recently Get Out, and I don't think it is as memorable or as interesting, and uses horror genre as well, certainly, but I don't think that was its intent either. I think what Wes Craven is doing and what he made with this film is very purposeful, and he obviously, even in 1991, knew the genre incredibly well. He plays within that. Certainly he would do send-ups of this genre with New Nightmare and Scream later in the 90s, but I think what he's really trying to show you is kind of the evils of what was going on and how people got in the disparity they currently were. And making that really the villain of a horror movie is probably very telling, because it feels almost so natural, you know? It doesn't feel like, you know, he's having a crazy leap with it, certainly. And frankly, I think there are certain things that go over the top, particularly like the gimp suit stuff and things like that. But overall, I find this film a really entertaining, really good Wes Craven film. And I think if it's not like at the top of his filmography, it's certainly kind of closer to it than maybe people are ready to admit. But it is certainly a very rich filmography to go into. I would definitely recommend going into this film, certainly not just because of what it's saying about the politics of the time, but what it also says about the politics now, and how many of that honestly hasn't changed is probably what makes this film a lot more universal than it ever intended to be at the time it was being made, which is actually an incredibly sad statement to say, but I think that's what makes The People Under the Stairs really the movie that it is. It talks about what's being swept under the rug, what's being forgotten, and the people that are profiting off of the fact that that's happening. So if you've seen The People Under the Stairs and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And I hope to see you tomorrow for day 4 of 5 of the Halloween week of videos. Thank you very much for watching, and have a happy Halloween.